What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and if you're enjoying the content that I'm uploading onto my channel, then feel free to subscribe, and you can also offer suggestions on topics and characters and storylines and whatnot that we can have discussions on later on in this channel. One of the things that you guys love to do is like send me pictures of stuff that you guys have. You guys send them to me on Twitter all the time. You send me pictures of like collections, different things like that. Dan Carmine sent me a picture of his collection, and that Red Hulk statue is amazing. It's super good, but I love it when you guys send me stuff. I love it when you guys send me pictures. Maybe I'll do like a PO box or something like that at some point. People can just like send me hand-drawn stuff if they want to or something along those lines. I can just like make a wall, that just has like all the stuff that you guys create. I have no idea if I'm going to do that, but it is always cool to send you, for you guys to like send me pictures of your collections and so on. Like, you guys should do that. You guys should tweet me pictures of your collections if you have them. I think it's a really cool thing. But all right, so Captain America Sam Wilson, Joel over at Cape Joel has been like harping on me to read this story. He's been like, dude, you have to read Captain America Sam Wilson. Every time I bring up Captain America Steve Rogers, which I really like right now, I think Nick Spencer is doing an amazing job with that story. He's always like, dude, you gotta read Captain America Sam Wilson. So I sat down and I finally read it. And here's the deal, like it's actually super good. It's a really cool story because it deals with a lot of common themes in the world right now, but it also deals, really, Nick Spencer writes well into the story, how like the reader perceives Sam Wilson, in the sense that, the average citizen, the average civilian in the story is basically a stand-in for a lot of people out there who don't care for Sam Wilson. And it's kind of cool that Nick Spencer recognizes that. But the funny thing is that this story is really told from the perspective of Sam Wilson while he's basically on an airplane talking to a couple of people, because of course, they recognize who he is. They're like, oh my God, you're Captain America Sam Wilson. But it's really cool because he kind of fills in the blanks. Now, a little bit of backstory here. Rick Remender took over the Captain America line of comics with Volume 7 as part of Marvel Now, I think it was. And there was a really cool interview that he did with Comic Book Resources, I think, and he was like, look, it was time for Steve Rogers to go away. There was only so much you could do with this character because he's been around since the 1940s. And it's like that with a lot of characters, right? I know a lot of people get really angry that Tony Stark's going away, but it's like, name me a story with Tony Stark that you can do that hasn't been done already. In the mid-1990s, Tony Stark formed his own team. It was called Force Works. Alcoholism got the better of him and he almost lost everything. That was called Demon in a Bottle. There was a story where he just decided to be a really huge dick to people. That was called Superior Iron Man. He pissed off the superhero community. That was Civil War. He was the director of S.H.I.E.L.D. At the end of Civil War, he got kicked out as being the director of S.H.I.E.L.D. He's been de-aged, he's been cloned, he's been part of the Guardians of the Galaxy. He's done everything. Aside from being the Sorcerer Supreme or being Captain America, he's done it all. And so, like, what do you do with a character like that? And so that's what Nick Spencer was saying with Captain America. Captain America's been de-aged. Captain America's been an animal. Captain America has lifted Thor's hammer before. Captain America has kind of been the stand-in for Iron Man, but not really. Captain America has done everything. And so it's like, what do you do with a character that's done it all? Well, you get rid of that character, you move them to the side, and you put somebody else in their stead. And the cool thing about this was that he looked around and he said, well, Sam Wilson is the best candidate to be the next Captain America because he was Captain America's sidekick as Falcon for decades. Who else would you pick in that scenario? And so what Rick Remender did is he basically engineered a story that saw the return of Arnim Zola. It saw Steve Rogers more or less being shunted off to this place called Dimension Z. He had his own story going on there, but what ended up happening at the conclusion of this run, which actually didn't last too long, but at the conclusion of this run, Steve Rogers basically lost the supersoldier serum, and because of that, it caused him, to age rapidly for a time. But it was basically Rick Remender saying Steve Rogers is no longer going to be Captain America. The shield was passed to Sam Wilson. Now, Sam Wilson played that role really going up until Secret Wars, but the issue with this was that with Marvel prepping for the launch of Secret Wars, there wasn't a whole lot of time to craft these super in-depth stories that would go on and on and on. Instead, the line of publications, really everything in Marvel Comics, had to gear itself towards the collapse of the multiverse and how the different heroes were dealing with it. And so what this did is it gave Nick Spencer the opportunity, when he took over the Captain America title in All New, All Different Marvel, to basically give Sam Wilson his own publication and do a lot of exploration here. Now, one of the cool things that we basically learn is, I guess with the story kind of kicking off, it deals a lot with Sam Wilson basically infiltrating a Hydra base, really leading to a fight with Crossbones, and we'll get to that here in a second. But what Nick Spencer does right off the bat is he basically gives us the supporting cast of Sam Wilson, in the sense that where Captain America had Wilson and he had the Avengers to a degree, Sam Wilson has Misty Knight, and he has, I think his name is Dennis Dunphy. He's called D-Man. He's a D-list hero at best. He was one of these mid 1980s creations. I think it came out of Mark Gruenwald, although I'm not going to swear to that. But it was just part of that, and we'll get a little more to a lot of the influences, that Gruenwald had, because really Nick Spencer reaches into that 1980s era of Captain America to bring us a lot of stuff in this story, especially the return of Carl Malice and the Serpent Society, which is kind of a strange choice here. But Misty Knight has a far more in-depth history. Of course, Dennis Dunphy was just kind of like a guy who was there in the background. He was kind of the spin-off of Wolverine to a degree in terms of his physical appearance. He has his own abilities that are woefully different from Wolverine. He's about as different as you can be in terms of powers, but regarding his physical appearance, he looked a lot like Wolverine, and that was really the attraction, was we're going to make a new character, make him look like Wolverine, and then people will read him. Nobody read it, nobody cared, and then he just kind of disappeared for a while. But the fact remains, Misty Knight has a far more grounded history in Marvel, and to be quite honest with you guys, I think pairing up Misty Knight and Sam Wilson works well. I mean, it works extremely well, and the reason why is because Misty is one of these street-level characters that had always kind of been this intel broker for years and years and years. It wasn't until around Civil War that Marvel finally gave her her own Heroes for Hire title, and it actually fit really well with her character. She's an information broker, she has all the right contacts, she's the person you go to when you want to find someone who's basically disappeared on the streets of wherever, in New York or wherever they happen to be in the world, whether or not, major villains or something like that. And so because of that, Misty Knight being here is just as much of a supporting role as she is someone that can help, Sam Wilson find information that he needs when it comes to individuals that are, needing to be captured, rounded up, or basically just kind of disappeared. Now, with regards to Sam Wilson's infiltration of this Hydra bunker, what we really learn here is that this whole operation is being ran by Crossbones. Now, the funny thing about this is that Crossbones is a well-known, Captain America villain. More so than that, he's a Steve Rogers villain. Now, keep in mind, Sam Wilson has abilities, but he does not have a super soldier serum. He's not on par with Steve Rogers the way he was originally done. His strength, speed, stamina is just not up there. Crossbones is really more of, he's really more in line with Sam Wilson in terms of, the abilities that he has, but because of his fighting prowess, because of the fact that he was trained by Taskmaster personally, the best fighter in all of Marvel Comics, Crossbones is a formidable adversary, and he gives Captain America a run for his money when it comes to fighting. So the idea of Sam Wilson being able to take down Crossbones is kind of laughable here. It's just kind of like, not really. But the cool thing about this is that we kind of switch back to the present moment. We have Sam Wilson defeating Crossbones, and we learn that in the eyes of these fans, who are, I guess, these guys who were talking to him, in the eyes of the stewardess on the plane, nobody likes him. No one likes Sam Wilson. It's one of those crazy things. The world hates Sam Wilson. And the reason for this is because of the fact that Sam does not look at the role of Captain America the same way Steve Rogers does. Historically speaking, and this is one of the cool things that Nick Spencer does here, historically speaking, Steve Rogers always looked at the mantle of Captain America as something that was designed to be a symbol, that, this idea that in the end, the people will always do the best thing, they'll always do the right thing, that people are great, that people are good, the American people will always come out on top, that moral fiber will always show itself when the smoke clears. Sam Wilson doesn't feel the same way. Instead, he's more of a grounded character. He's a lot more realistic and a lot less idealistic than Steve Rogers, but he sits down and he says, look, the political landscape has never been more split than it is now, just in the realm of politics. When you take into account the average person, the fact that people no longer talk out their differences, instead, they fight out their differences, then how can you look at this landscape of America and say, it's great, it's on the verge of civil war? I mean, and even then, like in the real world right now, the United States has never been this polarized since the age of the Civil War. This is the most polarized the country's been since the Civil War. And so because of that, Sam Wilson capitalizes on this and he says, look, you have organizations like SHIELD, you have teams like the Ultimates, you have, the NSA, you have these clandestine, government organizations that are involved in these really seedy acts. The country's reaching a boiling point, and when that happens, things are going to spill over. And so what he did anyway, the reason why the world hates him is because he basically goes to the press and he says, hey, look, here's what I believe as Captain America, here's where I stand as Captain America. Well, of course, with the media in the 21st century being how it is, it's all just spun out into a bunch of propaganda. Everybody twists out the message that he had, to suit their own personal agenda. So conservative newspapers are throwing out, conservative titles by twisting the message that Sam Wilson has, and progressive newspapers are twisting out his statement to make it look like it's more progressive. And so because of this, his message was basically lost in all this nonsense. In addition to this, because it's an age where people form opinions and then look for facts to support that opinion, as opposed to looking at the facts and then coming to an opinion, it basically means that people are picking and choosing which side they want to agree with. Those who hate Sam Wilson look for information to verify the fact that Sam Wilson is bad. Those people who like Sam Wilson look for information to verify that Sam Wilson is a good guy. And that's the point that he's making here. He's basically saying, look, this is a scenario where people are looking to verify their beliefs instead of looking around and saying, am I right for having my belief? And so the crazy thing that he did here, and this is where things get kind of funny, where Nick Spencer throws a little bit of humor into the story, he sits down and he basically says, hey, look, let's open up a hotline to the American people. You know, if the press is going to screw up my message, then I'm going to talk to the people directly. And so he basically created a hotline. Well, the most logical situation happens here in that the only people who ever participate in things like these are the people that you never want to participate in things like these. And so they all just start calling up with stupid stuff. Somebody calls up saying, well, they wouldn't give me a refund even though I had a receipt. It's stupid problems, you know, that just don't really deserve attention. And Sam Wilson says that. He's like, look, there are major issues out there. You not getting a refund is the least of my concerns right now. It's pretty far from anywhere near significant when it comes to my list of issues. More so than that, what he says is that every once in a while, an actual problem comes through here. Now, this is when Nick Spencer starts drawing into 1980s Mark Gruenwald Captain America, really 1970s and 1980s Mark Gruenwald Captain America, when we basically have a woman that sends him a message saying that her younger son, you know, her grandson Joaquin, has basically vanished. Now, of course, because of the fact that kid basically disappeared out in a desert, Sam Wilson, you know, alongside Misty Knight, go to investigate this. Now, again, this is a major difference between Sam Wilson as well as, you know, and Steve Rogers, because Steve Rogers would never go to search, you know, for somebody who just went missing in the desert. He'd say, that's a job for the cops. You know, now, of course, this woman says, well, the cops won't help me. You know, they won't do anything. Steve Rogers probably would have just been like, well, I mean, I'm sorry about your luck, lady. We got bigger problems to worry about here. You know, I mean, you know, maybe he'll come back. I don't know what to tell you. You know, Sam Wilson is a lot more grounded. Sam Wilson is kind of this guy where he's like, well, we need to solve this. The issue with Sam Wilson's perspective here is that if you go about solving every small problem, well, then suddenly you've got a million small problems to solve and you're running around everywhere failing to notice the bigger picture. And so because of this, while his intentions are in the right place, while his heart's in the right place, he's really kind of setting himself up for failure. But what ends up happening here is we actually pick up with this guide that's leading, you know, these people who are trying to enter the United States to, you know, a water cache that's there when they're suddenly met by really just a bunch of crazy assholes that are, you know, talking about being serpents or something along those lines. These are really just like jumped up Border Patrol agents who are, you know, I don't know, they're high on their own power, who knows. But the cool thing about this is this basically builds up to a much bigger persona, because what Sam Wilson says is that in the middle of all this, we essentially have Steve Rogers, you know, as an agent of S.H.I.E.L.D. showing up and telling him to stand down. Now, this is Nick Spencer drawing in a lot of the pre-Secret War stuff, because what had happened is during Jonathan Hickman's run on Avengers and New Avengers, because of the fact that Sam Wilson was basically the new Captain America, the question everybody had is, well, what happens to Steve Rogers now? I mean, what do you do with Steve Rogers if he's basically an old man? He lost his super soldier serum. It's essentially what happened to Nick Fury. Sam Wilson is a new Captain America. What's the place for Steve Rogers? And so what Hickman said is put him in charge of S.H.I.E.L.D. and have him hunt down the Illuminati, Iron Man, Doctor Strange, you know, Reed Richards, all these guys who are basically on the run trying to stop the incursions by destroying planets. And so it created this really cool cat and mouse game between Steve Rogers and the Illuminati during the collapse of the multiverse. But going into all new, all different Marvel, we find out again, you know, Maria Hill is basically the director of S.H.I.E.L.D. now, and Steve Rogers is really one of like the commanders, you know, one of the people who are subservient to Maria, but he's still basically, you know, answering questions to her. The other half of this, and this is really Nick Spencer setting up for the event Avengers Standoff, which we may or may not cover. It's really just the return of the cosmic cubes, basically. It is essentially some guy called the Whisperer who's leaked information about the fact that S.H.I.E.L.D. is using these cosmic cubes. Now, again, the whole Avengers Standoff story was basically, you know, like Pleasant Hill. It was the idea that Maria Hill and S.H.I.E.L.D. were using cosmic cubes for the purpose of recreating reality for villains, and then basically just keeping them contained. So it was putting them in a prison of their own minds, you know, by warping reality itself. But what Avengers Standoff did is it allowed Nick Spencer to segue into a new story with Steve Rogers by recreating his backstory and making him a Hydra agent, with this cosmic cube being used by the Red Skull to alter the history of Captain America, to basically alter reality. So again, it was really just kind of an event that led into another storyline, which is really how you should do crossover events, to be quite honest. But the fact remains here that in the midst of this conflict between Steve Rogers and Sam Wilson, we basically have this guy, you know, this serpent dude, essentially just taking off. You know, he just kind of teleports away. Now the question they have is, where's the guy getting this money to pull this off? You know, that kind of thing. But ultimately, Sam Wilson's able to track them down. Now the reason why Sam's able to do this is, keep in mind, he can basically, you know, one of his abilities is to form a psychic link with birds. Now, of course, Red Wing is kind of like his main bird. You know, that's his his side bird, his side chick, I guess. But the idea here is to create psychic links with birds. He's got eyes everywhere. I mean, he sees everything that goes on, and because of this, he's quickly able to track down, you know, this Border Patrol guy guy, this crazy serpent guy, I guess the guide that was leading, these immigrants to the United States. And we basically find out that they're all in cahoots, that the reason why they were working together is because there's a guy named Carl Malice in New York who's essentially paying people money to capture wealthy individuals who were out, wandering around in the desert or whatever it is, kidnap them and then bring them to New York. Now, the way that we know this is Nick Spencer really drawing on 70s and 80s Captain America is because we're introduced to Armadillo, to a guy named Antonio Rodriguez. Now, when I say introduced, I use that phrase loosely. I mean, Armadillo's been around really for a long time, but the idea here was that he was the introduction to Carl Malice's experiments, in the sense that Malice was basically going around and he was splicing human DNA with animal DNA and creating these hybrids. And so he had basically approached Antonio Rodriguez and said, hey, do you want superpowers? And Antonio was like, sure. And he says, well, then here, and he gave him an injection that blended his DNA with that of an armadillo. The issue is that, during the initial skirmish, of course, with Sam Wilson, with Captain America, during the old, Captain America and Falcon stories, the scenario was provided, or at least proposed to Armadillo, that if he stopped being a bad guy, that Sam Wilson, Steve Rogers would try to find a way to cure him. The issue is that his genes were forever modified. There was no way to cure him. And so over the course of his stories, his background features, whatever little stories he happened to appear in, he basically ended up, transitioning and going back to being a villain again. But something to keep in mind, and this is why I say Nick Spencer's work here is really interesting, is because Mark Gruenwald's 70s, 80s Captain America, there were some weird stories, but guys like Carl Malice, like, the introduction of Armadillo, Capwolf, stuff like that, those were things that were in there just to have stuff. It was just to have something there. Now, it doesn't mean that Gruenwald wasted people's time. Not at all. He was alongside, Dennis O'Neil and so on, and he was actually one of the guys behind Marvel's first major crossover event, Contest of Champions. But again, it's really cool to see a lot of these things make their return, to see a lot of these things come back. Now, of course, by going through and more or less interrogating, after, defeating Armadillo and interrogating this guide, this is when Sam Wilson begins to learn what's going on with regards to Carl Malice, kidnapping people, so on and so forth. And so now at this point, we basically pick up with the return of Capwolf. But the way that Nick Spencer does this is actually really, really cool. And I really like it because, again, it's a great homage to Gruenwald. I know I keep hyping that name up. It was just his writing in Captain America was a huge contributing factor to a lot of the future stories that came around with regards to Steve Rogers. It really kind of helped to usher, Rogers into the modern era of storytelling, the darker, grimier version of his stories, or at least as dark and grimy as they got with Steve Rogers. But basically what happens here is the investigations of Sam Wilson eventually lead him to the location of Dr. Carl Malice. Now, of course, a fight ensues between the two of them, but in the midst of this, Carl Malice basically incapacitates Sam Wilson and then turns him into Capwolf. And so again, this is really kind of cool. It's werewolf Captain America. It's a great tribute to when, Steve Rogers became a wolf. But now what this does is this circles back around to the reintroduction of the Serpent Society. Now, for those of you guys who are new to the Captain America landscape and really Marvel as a whole, the Serpent Society really appeared in Captain America number 310 in 1985, and they were yet another creation by Mark Gruenwald. But they were designed to be just kind of a team that was there, that really sought to subvert the efforts of Steve Rogers, in the sense that he was just out doing things, doing his superhero stuff, and they would in turn, come around and attack him. But they were never considered to be like a major credible threat to the heroes of the world. In truth, they were really more of like a thorn in people's sides. They were just kind of like a hassle, but they were still pretty solid. They were a lot more structured, a lot more regimented, a lot more reliable, and a lot more organized than like this Sinister Six, or Advanced Idea Mechanics, or even Hydra to a degree. The issue here, or at least what Nick Spencer's doing, is he's grabbing the concept of the Serpent Society and he's kind of wrapping this back around into this organization that is very structured, that is very regimented, but a lot more complex than we originally thought. Now, what I mean by that is, again, because Nick Spencer really kind of toys with the notion of people, how we function, so on and so forth, the Serpent Society is essentially infiltrating different organizations across the country for really to use them for their own ends. So the way this is done is by the Serpent Society really kind of talking about how things function. When it comes to the idea of like, camps overseas, or I guess, factories overseas or different things like that, what the leader of the Serpent Society basically says is everybody knows those working conditions are really bad. Everybody knows those people suffer every day. Everybody knows that there are kids who are forced to make iPhones and shoes and things like that. But it's much like a steak. People don't care what happens to the steer. All they care is that the ribeye that ends up on their plate when they order their food is delicious. And that's what he says here. He says, yeah, everybody knows the working conditions are bad, but when the new iPhone gets released, no one cares about the working conditions. They care about the new iPhone. And so he says it's just how people are. It's just human nature. And so by appealing to this company, and of course, we basically have an outlier here. We have one of the guys that doesn't agree with him. But by talking to this company, he basically says, hey, look, here's the proposition. We have, the ability to basically cure disease, to cure illness. Yes, it requires Malice's efforts, and yes, it is pretty seedy in terms of how it unfolds, but the executives will not be held accountable to this. Nobody will know that they're there. They're going to be behind the scenes. Essentially, what'll happen is these companies will fund the work of malice, Serpent Society will sell that off, and then they'll turn around and give the companies a portion of the proceeds that they make. And so in a sense, it's basically easy money. And so because of this, it's really Nick Spencer kind of hitting home at the idea that, corporations are inherently greedy, corporations are inherently bad. But the way that he kind of, I guess confronts this, or the way that he balances this out, is by saying that people in and of themselves are also accountable as well. If people know that the working conditions for the product that they buy are absolutely horrid and they continue to buy the product anyway, it means they're okay with those working conditions being bad. When he talks about the notion of people buying homes they can't afford, he really points to the idea and says, no one made those people buy homes that they couldn't afford, and when they turn around and lost them, nobody made anybody do that. Now, the other half of this is that Nick Spencer's kind of, toying with the notion that there was a lot of trickery, there was a lot of deception going on when it came to the subprime mortgage sector, things like that. But at the end of the day, the people who bought those homes didn't take the time to go and read how mortgages work. They just assumed that what they were told was absolute truth and just went with it. And so it's really kind of Nick Spencer blending the idea of personal accountability, saying people are responsible for the things they do, but also kind of toying with the idea that people have been hoodwinked and people have been tricked. And so it's really him just saying, yeah, it's how these corporations function, it's really just kind of how they operate, so on and so forth. But from here, we basically pick up with the character of Rachel Layton. Now, Rachel Layton is an interesting concept in the realm of Captain America because she was part of the original Serpent Society, and her origin story tied directly into the origin of Crossbones, in the sense that Crossbones himself basically led a gang. When he was younger, he was in New York. Eventually, he moved on. He was trained by Taskmaster, eventually became a henchman of Red Skull. Rachel Layton was a young girl during the early days of Crossbones' life who wanted to join the gang as well. The issue was that Crossbones basically used her to his own ends in some very unsavory ways, and then she just kind of fell down the rabbit hole of the criminal underworld. Now, eventually she turned over a new leaf. She became a hero. But the idea here is that Nick Spencer's kind of, returning her character, not really reinvigorating her, but returning her character. But it's this concept that Spencer's always hitting on, that in, truth be told, when it comes to those individuals who are criminals and those individuals who are good guys in the corporate world, there's really no way to tell the difference. That, in his mind, and this is really what's kind of interesting here, is that in his mind, when you have people in these shady situations, if, for example, you're walking down the road and you see a guy getting mugged, doing nothing is the same thing as mugging that guy, because you're doing nothing to stop it. You're basically allowing it to happen, right, wrong, or otherwise. That seems to be the stance that's being taken here. But again, it's really just, Cap Wolf working alongside Rachel Layton, and the two of them, trying to root out this Serpent Society as best they can. But of course, Sam Wilson is inevitably taken prisoner, and the reason why is because Rachel Layton basically turns on him. Now, this is also Nick Spencer pointing at the idea of what's happening right now with regards to, superheroes struggling. It's not a great, big, huge, overt thing. It's not a massive deal. It's really just him, him saying, hey, look, everybody's struggling in this day and age. Now, it's really cool because we have this, on this down level, street level superhero landscape, in the sense that for Rachel Layton, because she had tried to go legit, she had more or less been thrust in a situation where she lost the people that she cared about. The legit life of a superhero wasn't enough to compensate for that. She eventually became a stripper for a time, and then ultimately just went back to being a bad guy because that's where all the money was. That's where basically people could afford things. It's because being a superhero, yeah, it's difficult to do. Yeah, you're doing the good thing, but at the end of the day, it doesn't pay the bills. And again, this is Nick Spencer basically saying that when it comes to people, whether he's right or wrong about this, when it comes to people, we inherently want the greatest reward for the least amount of work that we can possibly get away with. If it's possible for us to do nothing and get paid to do it, people will probably do that. It doesn't mean that they're bad. It just means that it's in human nature to be that way. And so because of that, we basically have this, Misty Knight kind of breaking into the facility of the Serpent Society in order to free Sam Wilson. Again, we know this because of the fact that Misty Knight has all kinds of contacts. She knows where they're at. She knows how they're functioning, that sort of thing. But something else that I also want you guys to notice too is that we basically see, we really have a new Falcon emerging. And again, with Joaquin having been rescued by Sam Wilson, but also having been subjected to Dr. Malice's treatments, he's basically merged with a Falcon. That's essentially what he is. He's basically just a guy who's half Falcon now, biologically. And that's kind of, Nick Spencer doing a different take on the character. Of course, where Sam Wilson was Falcon in name only, he had contact with birds, but he wasn't actually avian. Joaquin very much is. And again, it's just kind of a reimagining of the Falcon concept. Of course, we have Falcon basically rescuing Sam Wilson from the Serpent Society itself, but this is when we start to get into the notion of, I would say, Nick Spencer kind of hitting the nail on the head with regards to this story and how Sam Wilson functions. That's one of the cool things about this. Sam Wilson, again, is a very, very grounded Captain America. He's not like Steve Rogers, where he only really partakes in the Avengers. He only really faces, world-shattering threats. He doesn't really concern himself with, what's going on the street level. Sam Wilson's not like that. He's very Daredevil, very Spider-Man, very Jessica Jones, Luke Cage-esque in terms of how how he functions as a superhero, which is relatively new to the realm of, I guess, Captain America landscape. But with all these guys fighting together and essentially casting off the Serpent Society, we have Sam Wilson basically tracking down and locating these corporate heads, who are all part of the Serpent Society's plans. And what Sam Wilson says is, all of you guys are going to go to jail. Every last one of these guys are going to go to jail. But their response is, you can't take us to jail, because if you do, everything will fail. And this is why, Nick Spencer gets really political. I mean, the guy was a senator. At least I think he ran for senator. He ran for something in the city of Cincinnati, some kind of political position. But the guy has experience in politics, and this is basically what he draws on here. He says, hey, look, there is such a thing as being too big to fail. You basically have guys here who run corporations that are publicly traded. There are stockholders. People's retirement is tied up in these things. People who are invested in mutual funds and so on and so forth, they depend on the success of these companies in order to keep their retirement intact. What these guys say is, look, if you arrest all of us, it means that our company shares are going to tank. All the value tied into those companies are going to tank, and people are going to lose their homes, they're going to lose their retirement, the whole 9 yards. They're so intertwined with society that Sam Wilson basically has to let a majority of them go. Now, he does take one guy and say, hey, you're going to be the one that goes. Everybody else is going to, they're going to keep going on. But in the end, I'm also going to make sure they suffer as well. The crazy thing about this is that Joaquin, the new Falcon, is basically playing very much the same role that Sam Wilson would have played. Like, are you really going to let these guys go? But this is really the function of Captain America, as Sam Wilson is beginning to pick it up, that it's very much political, that it's not just, hey, well, let's just be superheroes and just do whatever we want to, that there's a lot of red tape, there's a lot of consequences for the things that happen. And so in a perfect world, he would just grab all these guys and take them all to jail. But in the end, why would he condemn millions of Americans to the failure of a handful of people? And that's kind of how this balancing act gets played. And that's really what Nick Spencer's hitting at, is there are people who have intertwined themselves so well into society, into the necessity of the economic system, that if they go down, they will take everything with it. And so they're essentially holding the economy, holding the American people hostage. And so in the end, of course, Sam Wilson essentially lets that one guy go, but it's really Nick Spencer kind of setting the stage too and saying, hey, we have a new Falcon, we have, Demolition Man as part of Sam Wilson's team, we have Misty Knight. Again, this is really just kind of him setting the stage with regards to all new, all different Marvel, saying, here's where we reside with Sam Wilson at the moment. Here's what his stories are going to be about. They're going to be more grounded. They're going to be focusing more on the average American in terms of how they view superheroes. They're going to be focusing on the perception of people with regards to Sam Wilson, on whether or not he's actually Captain America. That'll be a huge part of the Civil War story, especially when we talk about the return of U.S. Agent. It's really kind of just a grounding. It's really just sort of showing us where things reside with regards to Sam Wilson himself. But if you guys are new here to Comics Explained, you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.